The Epsilon Omega Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated presents the annual Scholarship Showcase. Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated has provided over 100 years of service since its founding in 1908 at Howard University by African American women. Today, Alpha Kappa Alpha's membership consists of more than 300,000 college-educated professional women in more than 950 chapters internationally. Members work to improve social and economic conditions throughout the world through volunteer service. The Macon chapter, chartered in 1952, continues to foster the ideals of the international organization with the commitment of scholarship and community service. The Scholarship Showcase of the Epsilon Omega Omega chapter awards scholarships to deserving students annually. Epsilon Omega Omega chapter has served the Middle Georgia community through a wide variety of initiatives and programs since its chartering. Scholarship awards have remained top priority. In the last 10 years, over $100,000 in scholarships have been awarded to deserving Middle Georgia high school seniors and college students. The Eddie Mae Booth Leadership Scholarship is presented in honor of charter member Mrs. Eddie Mae Booth. Mrs. Booth is a distinguished charter member of Epsilon Omega Omega chapter and has been an active member serving in every capacity and holding every office of the sorority through the years. Mrs. Booth graduated from Ballard High School and Fort Valley State College. She retired after 34 years of service to the Bibb County school system, where she was a media specialist, social studies teacher, and a high school counselor. Mrs. Booth's leadership is noteworthy in that she was instrumental in the chartering of the Epsilon Omega Omega chapter in 1952. Her determination and leadership skills spurred members to victory's height as she served as president from 1953 to 1957. Our dear charter member, Mrs. Booth, volunteered with Loaves and Fishes Ministry, Ronald McDonald House, and Mount Moriah's Charlie Clark House for women out of prison. She is a lifelong member of Mount Moriah Baptist Church. Mrs. Booth's legacy of leadership is honored today. The Ruth Johnston Community Service Scholarship is presented in honor of charter member Mrs. Ruth Bronson Johnston. Mrs. Johnston was a 67-year member who became an Ivy Beyond the Wall July 2010. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Talladega College. She also received master's degrees from Atlanta University in Arts and Fort Valley State in Guidance and Counseling. She taught 21 years in the Bibb County Public Schools and was a member of the Washington Avenue Presbyterian Church, where she served as an elder. As a charter member of the Epsilon Omega Omega chapter and former president, Mrs. Johnston was instrumental in the chartering of the Iota Eta chapter at Mercer University and the Kappa Eta chapter on the campus of Georgia College and State University. Mrs. Johnston was a loyal and active member whose love for the sorority was exhibited in her community service. She was committed to feeding the hungry and taking care of the children of the community. Mrs. Johnston was a breath of fresh air who encouraged all to give back. Mrs. Johnston's legacy of service is honored today. The Valeria Williams Music Scholarship is presented in honor of Mrs. Valeria Smith Williams. Mrs. Williams was a dedicated member to Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She became an Ivy Beyond the Wall January 2011. Mrs. Williams served in various capacities and was the first and only member of the local chapter to serve 2 times in the office of president non-consecutively. She was a dedicated member of many professional and social organizations. Mrs. Williams was able to remain an active, participating, and contributing member of Alpha Kappa Alpha for 65 years. For many years, Mrs. Williams provided music to the local chapter as she played the piano and later donated her personal piano to ensure music rang throughout the Pearl Community Center for many years to come. She was a breath of fresh air as she continued to participate in the activities. She held music workshop sessions and played the piano beautifully. Mrs. Williams' love for music was infectious, as she was passionate about having melodic tunes at various events. Mrs. Williams' legacy of music is honored today. The HBCU scholarship is presented to a student who attends a historically black college or university. Historically black colleges and universities are institutions of higher education that were established before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the intention of primarily serving the African American community. Most of these institutions were founded in the years after the American Civil War. Their purpose was to provide opportunities for higher education for African Americans who were prohibited, disqualified, or limited to attending predominantly white institutions. Today, there are 101 public or private HBCUs in the United States. Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated is dedicated to implementing programs of service that enhance the social, economic, and educational well-being of the local, national, and international communities. Programs remain the heart of AKA. Through our program focus on education, an emphasis has been placed on preserving the legacy of historically black colleges and universities. Epsilon Omega Omega promotes HBCUs and encourages students to attend an HBCU as a sustainability measure. Through this effort, we are committed to financially supporting a college student from the Middle Georgia area who attends a historically black college or university through scholarship. The legacy of HBCUs is honored today. The Carolyn Taylor Thomas Undergraduate Soror Scholarship is presented in honor of Ms. Carolyn Taylor Thomas. Mrs. Carolyn Taylor Thomas was a 1944 graduate of Spelman College. In July of 1947, she was initiated into Alpha Omega Chapter, the first graduate chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. The Alpha Omega chapter is located in Cleveland, Ohio. Mrs. Thomas was initiated by AKA's third international president, Ms. Pearl Mitchell. Mrs. Thomas has been a member of Epsilon Omega Omega for over 25 years and has served in many capacities. Most notable, for 15 years, Mrs. Thomas served as a graduate advisor of the Kappa Eta chapter on the campus of Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. In December 2009, Epsilon Omega Omega celebrated her by naming an award in her honor. The Carolyn Taylor Thomas Undergraduate Scholarship was instituted in recognition of the committed service she rendered as a graduate advisor. This scholarship is given every year to an undergraduate member of either chapter supervised by Epsilon Omega Omega. Mrs. Thomas truly demonstrated her love for the undergraduates and was affectionately named the Dean of Graduate Advisors by the 16th South Atlantic Regional Director, Mrs. Ella Springs Jones. Mrs. Thomas's legacy of sisterhood is honored today. Through this presentation, we congratulate the scholarship recipients and honor the women of Epsilon Omega Omega, whose legacy we celebrate through scholarship. We are truly honored with their leadership, spirit, longevity, and tenacity. The lessons and values taught will forever be instilled in our hearts and minds for generations to come. We are thankful for having had the opportunity to learn and grow from each of these women. To thy honor and glory today, these women have allowed us to stand on their shoulders with greater laurels win and greater tasks to begin as we've captured a vision fair. We are proud of the women of Epsilon Omega Omega, whose legacy we celebrate through scholarship. The Epsilon Omega Omega chapter would also like to extend expression of congratulations to all of our scholarship recipients, graduating sorors of Iota Eta and Kappa Eta, and to the graduating high school and college students who are the children of Epsilon Omega Omega chapter members. Congratulations!